Gene Corbin will serve as our moderator tonight. Since 2011, he has served as Harvard College's Assistant Dean of Student Life for Public Service. Before taking on his current role, Dean Corbin served as Executive Director for Phillips Brooks House, known to many of us as PBHA. PBHA is a student-led nonprofit at Harvard College that engages students in service and advocacy programs that benefit thousands of people right here in the Boston and Cambridge area. Again, I'm so pleased that you're all here with us tonight. Now please join me in welcoming all of our panelists and our moderator, Gene Corbin.
I want to thank Heather and everyone from the Harvard Alumni Association for pulling this wonderful event together. And I want to thank all of you that are here or watching the live stream online for your own commitment to public service, as evidenced by you're taking time out of your busy schedules to participate in this. I'm really excited about this event. Excited to spend time speaking with some esteemed faculty members that are really living on the cutting edge of where scholarship meets real-world concerns and engagement in public service. So I am. They each have bios that could go on for about 10 pages. So I am not going to do them justice in just telling you a couple of sentences about each of them, but I believe you have longer bios in your materials. They're all quite accomplished. We're very appreciative and fortunate to have you all on this panel. Emily Click, to my left, is the Assistant Dean for Ministry Studies and Field Education and Lecturer on Ministry here at the Harvard Divinity School. Her scholarship has focused on new ways of conceptualizing connections among adult education theory, human development theory, and education for religious leadership. And I know in addition to numerous publications, she spends much of her time overseeing students in their field education experiences, which really brings her in contact with the ways students are involved in the community and the world. Laurence Ralph, in the middle, is assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and African American Studies at Harvard University. He is currently working on an ethnography entitled Half Dead: The Unexpected Ways We Injure the Urban Poor. And his undergrad and grad seminars range in interesting topics such as the hip-hop generation and post-civil rights black politics, to health, society, and subjectivity in the American context, and disease, disability, and the body. And I would add that Professor Ralph serves on the FAS Standing Committee on Public Service, which is seeking to find ways to forge connections between public service and scholarship. Last but far from least, to my farthest left, is Christine Letts. If you become friends with Professor Letts, she lets you call her Chris. So I think we can all now call her Chris. She is the Rita E. Hauser Senior Lecturer in the Practice of Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School. She has extensive experience in private, nonprofit, and public management. She joined the faculty of the Harvard Kennedy School in 1992 and was the founding executive director of the Hauser Center for Nonprofit Organizations, now known as the Hauser Institute for Civil Society at the Center for Public Leadership. And I would add that when I'm in a jam, Chris is one of the people I turn to for advice, and many undergraduates take her courses and rave about it. So we're fortunate to have Chris with us as well. I'd like to begin by asking each of you just to take a few minutes to share your thoughts on why it is important for Harvard University to be engaged in public service. And Emily, maybe starting with you.
Well, I think it's first of all important because we are an influential leader in the world, and we say so often that we stand for excellence, and excellence in scholarship, does not stand in isolation to, but should be deeply partnered with and entangled with the kind of service to human need, deep human need, and building human community that many of us are committed to. And I think that Harvard can be a leader in that arena in a way that's just as excellent as our, reputation for academic leadership.
Wonderful. Laurence?
Great. I think that, well, for me, I think that Harvard values excellent scholarship, and I think that the relationship between scholarship and public service is intimately connected, at least from my perspective. And I came to this realization really while I was in graduate school. I was volunteering at anti-violence programs around Chicago. I went to the University of Chicago, and at first it was kind of a break from the kind of rigors of graduate school, but eventually, as these things go, it became part of my research interest and then part of my ultimately dissertation project. And I began working with communities on how they were addressing the problem of gang violence and gun violence in particular. And, what I learned from that experience is that, basically I learned how to listen, and I learned how to not kind of map what I was learning in graduate school onto these communities, but kind of learn from what the communities were doing themselves and try to figure out a way that I could just be of help. And I think that scholarship can come from that. And I see that in Harvard students who are very ambitious and want to be leaders and have the opportunity to engage in exciting opportunities. And I think that, explicitly talking about the connection between research and public service can help them develop as people, as scholars, and as future leaders.
I'll go back to the title of this session, which is Do More or Do Better. I think it's our job to take the passion and energy and experience that our students come in with and give them new knowledge and skills to do better. I think most of you are engaged enough in public life to know that a lot of the data that's coming out says we really haven't made much progress at all on poverty, on inequality, on improving a lot of people who are less advantaged, and we got to change that. I mean, what we've got to do is influence graduates, undergraduates, to go out and do something different, and that's not doing just more, because it's not clear that more of the same isn't doing harm if it's actually supporting the status quo. So that's our job.
Wonderful. Thank each of you. I'm now just going to throw out some questions now that we've heard from each of you that I hope stimulate a conversation, and I'll jump in at points. But I'd love to hear you all's thoughts on how engagement in public service enriches academic learning. Any thoughts, I hope?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot is already going on in terms of this question of enriching learning through public service. As Jean mentioned, I stand on the Faculty of Arts and Science Committee for Public Service, and we oversee about over 125 student-led organizations who are explicitly dealing with public service, as well as 500 students each summer are engaging in public service activities, and by the time that most undergraduates graduate, 52% of them will be engaged in some type of public service. So a lot is already going on. I think the challenge is honing in on what people want to do and trying to help them cultivate sustainable relationships. I mean, I think as a professor, I see it as part of my job to kind of, when people are engaging in these new and exciting kind of opportunities, but also very challenging opportunities that sometimes question how they conceive of themselves as people, as students. I think part of the job is just to hold them in that space of discomfort and allow them to grow through it. And I think that, learning, that's part of the big process of learning, and that's what public service in particular can add to the rich education that students are already getting.
I love that expression, hold them in the place of discomfort. Many of our students, I know this is true across the university, come to us having done very significant either jobs or, volunteer work in public service. But many of them have grown very frustrated because of exactly what Professor Letts was saying, this intractability of the kinds of problems that they're drawn with great passion to address. So I think there's a couple of things that we have to offer in our environment that really help add value for these students who are already so talented and already so experienced. And one of those is this intersection with cultivating the habits of mind or of critical thinking, and not seeing them as separate realms. But it's one thing to say that. It's another thing, to really work at how you bring those together. And it's very uncomfortable when you do, because when you start realizing the structural issues in racism and in violence and so forth, it increases, your discomfort, and you don't necessarily understand better how to work on it. And that's why you need to have an environment sort of facilitated by a professor who's very knowledgeable, but one who can pull upon the incredible level of knowledge that's there amongst the students and demonstrate how what people already know can then be brought to bear upon what they're experiencing in these sometimes very uncomfortable situations. I love that phrase. I'm gonna borrow it and steal it.
Chris, you made the point that academic learning can help students in doing better, can inform their engagement in the world. I want to try to flip that around and ask how does engagement in the world, experiential type of learning, how can that make teaching and learning better?
Okay, well, can I talk about my course?
Sure,
Okay.
please. That's the perfect example.
Great. Wasn't sure. Okay, I mean, we at the Kennedy School have been, trying to build more experiential learning into our coursework, and it's the, more of the management side of the faculty, and in fact, some of us who are more engaged with the nonprofit sector, public service, that kind of thing, that have been doing this. A colleague and I had the opportunity to start a new course a year ago, and it came about as a result of a foundation in Texas that gave us $100,000 that students could give out as grant money as part of a philanthropy course. And the aspiration of the donor is that these students would aspire to become philanthropists. They would kind of practice this largesse and do that. Well, our intent about the course is actually quite different than that. And our intent is for the students to learn about public problem solving. And so the course, which is public problem solving and philanthropy, has them working in teams on a public problem in Boston. And Jim Bildner, my colleague, and I designed the course very specifically to give the students the opportunity to intersect with their own community. The gift was to Harvard, and it is because they are at Harvard that they get this opportunity, and we thought that opportunity should be passed on to the community. And so, whether they're interested in international development or whatever, they have to pick a problem in Boston. And we have 10 teams this year. We have 57 students and 10 teams of things from food, systemic poverty, trafficking, mental health, neighborhood revitalization, that kind of thing. And their job and their academic work is to learn about the problem. They have to go out and understand the demographics. They have to do a lot of work on the internet. They have to do literature searches. They have to understand interventions, theories of change. Then they begin to look at what are the strengths and weaknesses of the interventions and the sectoral responses to this problem. Then they begin to develop ways of comparing the nonprofits in the field. And then finally, their field work ends with a choice about where they get to give their money. And along the way, we give them regular coursework in the history and practices of philanthropy, history and practices of the nonprofit sector, and things like that. And the whole idea is that they get a different skill set about how to think about philanthropy. They learn about what works and what doesn't work, and about all the prevailing ways that people are doing this. But our preference is to give them kind of a skill set related to critical thinking and investigation of a problem in a real world setting, right down, right on the T lines and things like that, that will carry through in the way they think about their community, in the way they think about any kind of intervention, any kind of volunteer work they end up doing. We want them to think about, what problem are we working on here? And who's working on it? And, can I make a difference? And it's my responsibility to actually understand the broader context, instead of just feeling good about a singular intervention that I might make.
And I'll say again that I know several undergraduates that have found their way into Chris's course and just rave about it. So thank you, Chris. I'm really interested in, I'm thinking about Chris's course on philanthropy and how it would be different if students were only reading textbooks on philanthropy. And I don't want to just pick on Chris. What are you all's thoughts on how this engagement in the real world deepens learning, the opportunity to apply scholarship to the real world deepens learning?
As you mentioned in your intro, I direct a field education program here at Harvard Divinity School. We have over 100 students at a time engaged 350 to 400 hours in a site, which equals a whole academic year or full-time in the summer. And, they're doing the kind of work that Chris is talking about in terms of analyzing problems and so forth. But they're being supervised by an accredited supervisor in the site. So whether it's a church where a pastor has learned how to mentor students, or a nonprofit where the executive director is meeting weekly with the student to do the kind of reflection on the site that helps them to really learn about what's going on. Very often these folks who are supervisors, who are executive directors, pastors, rabbis, they're on the vanguard of understanding how not only to define problems or look at problems, but what kinds of approaches ought to be taken. And they're very interested in what our students do. And this is something that I just want to push back a little bit on wording and say, I don't see what they're doing as applying, their learning. It is an integrative component for their learning. I think that's what you were getting at with your question. But I don't like the word applying, because again, that's sort of like what you were saying about mapping our learning onto a setting rather than going to the setting and having it teach and inform, which is, I think, what you were getting at.
We have much to learn from communities as well as textbooks, right? Other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that part of the most profound way that it's different is that it kind of turns the notion of the expert on its head, and like who exactly has the expertise in such a setting. I think when you go into work on practical problems, you see where the textbook research reaches its limitations and what people are doing in the service of practical, pragmatic, everyday problems. I think in African and African American studies, we have a similar component, a similar public service component called the Social Engagement Initiative. And students are writing their senior theses on problems, real world problems, so to speak. And so they kind of combine these theoretical lessons they've learned and to basically problem solve and to solve real world problems. We have a student now who's working on mobile healthcare units around Boston. So trucks that go around administering healthcare in different Boston neighborhoods. And I think that just seeing the ways in which healthcare can change from neighborhood to neighborhood, and the immediacy of it is something that can't be taught in a classroom. It's something that exceeds the bounds of a textbook. So I think in that way, it's critical.
Shifting gears a little bit, we've talked some about academic coursework and its intersection with public service. What about the personal development of students? How is public service critical to the development of students? And Emily, I know this is your field, which you've researched and written about, so maybe kick us off by sharing your thoughts.
Well, as I mentioned, it's one thing to have a passion that you want to engage in the world, but people very quickly burn out when it's all about doing things and trying to make a difference, but one has not cultivated the kind of habits that foster kind of agility that we have to sustain ourselves in engaging in incredibly complex situations over time. So one of the things we do here is that we partner our field education program with a class that's called Meaning Making. And in that class, we have experts who are actually all active in the community in leadership roles, who kind of hold a space. And that's where the students come and present cases and reflect on what they're learning, mostly looking at failure, which I think is at the heart of cultivating habits of humility about what you can assert and how you can embrace difference and understand the value of conflict. So we try to develop the capacity to look at failure as an avenue of learning, an avenue of growth, and actually a necessary partner for doing the kind of work that really makes a difference in the long run.
I'll speak, I'll brag about Phillips Brooks House Association for a little bit. I've just joined the board. I'm very, very proud and humbled that they have chosen me to join the board. And again, as Laurence said, there are over 100 programs or organizations that students volunteer for every year. But on the student development side, what's truly astonishing is the level of leadership and initiative that the students take on and take very seriously. And what we're doing is churning this leadership. They will lead these organizations for a few years, but then they have to, get successors and that kind of thing. And they don't just do the same work every year. What amazes me is that the leaders take a look at what kind of jobs their volunteers do. I heard a presentation just a month ago about the leaders of an organization that provides assistance to people who are going to small claims court. And they said that gets very repetitive because 95% of the people have the same questions and issues, and just going over the same thing over the phone is not very interesting. So these student leaders took it upon themselves to think about what can we do to make this work more interesting, and have initiated a bunch of things. So this is an example of doing better and not just doing more, just doing the same thing. They recognize we're not going to keep these people. How can we recruit more people when we say, come and do this really boring job? And they get that. They are learning about leadership by practicing it. That's just what is really amazing. They don't just think about their own development, but they think about the development of their peers. They take the volunteers that are under their organizations very seriously. Again, a lot of this is just happening through their own initiative. And I think we've got a lot of responsibility to actually enhance that and to leverage it even further.
And sometimes to stay out of the way.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, wonderful words, Chris. So there's leadership development, moral development that maybe doesn't happen in the classroom. And I always hate the phrase extracurricular. I mean, these are co-curricular, and we're holistic human beings that are developing in ways, not just the intellectual way. I don't know, Laurence, anything to add on this front?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a good idea is to kind of take a step back and to look at the climate that a Harvard undergrad student inhabits, right? And so this is a climate in which there are proliferation of NGOs on almost any topic, and it's almost expected that one will have some kind of experience working with the NGO or nonprofit, perhaps going overseas and working in an environment. And I think actually the challenge the challenge to personal development is to enhance that experience and to make it more meaningful, so that it's not just a summer-long thing that one did when they were in college, but developing the habits so that it can be a kind of lifelong value, and that it can be something that people view the intrinsic importance of and continue to develop and find the kind of urgency of actually passing down something precious to other Harvard undergraduates. And so I think again, part of doing better is to realize that, the public service experience is not enough, but in and of itself, it's not enough. But we have the resources to kind of enhance that experience and to make it so that it is something more meaningful and more valuable.
Can I add one thought? And that is, the friendships that you all have as alumni, I think are an additional component. I'm thinking about Gloria Hammond and Liz Walker, who are graduates of HDS and work very independently in a lot of ways, but have also worked together on establishing schools in Sudan and working for justice for women there. And that, that's a friendship that's very, very powerful, and that both of them would testify has made it more sustainable to do incredibly difficult work. And I can list many, many other of these kinds of friendships that are really, I think, one indispensable part of what happens at Harvard, that you find other people that are like minds.
That's a great segue to another question I'd love to get you all's thoughts on. President Faust, as you all know, has made public service a priority, and Laurence and I are on a committee at the college that's thinking hard about how do we get more students involved, how do we create better pathways to public interest careers, how do we forge these connections between the classroom and engagement in the community and the world. And since we largely have an audience of alumni and many alumni watching the live stream online, I would be remiss if I did not ask the question, what are you all's thoughts on how alumni can help in this effort?
Well, I pull upon alumni extensively. My supervisors for these 100 students that are in field ed, a lot of them are alumni of Harvard Divinity School. But in addition to that, hands-on work, because they go out and they establish these organizations that are making a difference, and then they provide a welcoming space for students to come and learn with them. This is incredibly powerful, and this is worldwide. This is not just Boston area. So thank you, alumni that I know I'm thanking that are around the world, including we have one in Nicaragua, and Maritza Hernandez is right here and has brought a group of students to Nicaragua, to one of our alums right there. But also, the alumni are some of the experts who can, they can call me up and say, I know you're teaching this course on leadership. Let me tell you, you need to shift what you're saying. That's very, very helpful feedback loop. And so I can only encourage more of that.
Yeah, now I think I would add that when we think about opportunities for students, and they're very good at finding opportunities themselves, but I think, as you're alluding to, these personal relationships do make a big difference, especially when people find themselves isolated and find themselves uncomfortable in a place that they haven't been before, right? It's very important that they can have not just a professor to talk to, but somebody who's actually living in the same area of the world sometimes, somebody who's engaging in that same kind of work and has been for a long time and will be doing that for a long time. So I think alumni are indispensable in that respect. And they're also indispensable in just giving a lot of our undergraduates the opportunity to serve in the first place. I think that were it not for alumni, a lot of the public's, it wouldn't be 100 and something, initiatives that students are engaged in, and there wouldn't be 500 students each year during the summer working at these different places. So I think alumni are critical for those kind of opportunities as well.
Yeah, one way of thinking about what alumni can do is to think about where you're stuck. Think about where you think you've got it all figured out, and hire one of our students to do a study, to do an internship, to work for you, and give them one of these tough questions that will actually allow them to use some of the skills they've built to help you think differently, because that will reinforce that's what their role in life is all about. That it is to think critically rather than just learn to do the same thing. And I mean, I had a whole career as a manager before I joined the faculty at the Kennedy School, and I know how easy it is to get stuck after doing well. I mean, doing really well, running an organization. You do a certain thing for 4 or 5 years, and you need people to shake it up. And I mean, that's what our students can do. We've got loads of different types of assignments that enrich, their learning. Again, whether it's during the school year working on master's theses or policy analysis exercises we have at the Kennedy School, internships working on very specific questions, research that students can do under supervision of a faculty member. And so, staying engaged and having a dialogue with whichever school you are interested in, with your colleagues about, how can we bring some of these students over here? How can we create some work that they could do back at school for us? How can they help us remain engaged in the most vital questions and issues and latest ideas? And so, and again, some of that requires you to kind of be open to different learning.
I know also our Office of Career Services has done an amazing project of filming interviews with some of our alums, and that's available to our students online. And it's a real source of inspiration, because very often graduating from Harvard Divinity School, there's not an obvious career path. Right. And so one can feel like, what am I going to do? And a lot of times these alums are very candid about the first few years being a bit rough. And so it's a truthful word of encouragement about how you engage over the long haul, rather than saying, I arrived and I'm really successful and this is what I'm doing. A lot of times in that sort of inner forum, there can be that spelling out of how one navigates something that's really hard to figure out.
Thank you all. So time always passes too quickly when you're talking to interesting people, but I promise to save time for you all to ask questions as well. So you can address your question to one of these professors in particular or to the entire panel. And I always like to remind people that a good question is somewhat succinct and ends in a question mark. But I'd love to open up the floor to you all's questions.
I'll try to be succinct. This is a question and sort of a challenge to all of you. I appreciate many of the things you've said, and many of you have touched on the concern, maybe the danger that this becomes, something I did with my summer, or something I did in the second semester of my third year, but not something that graduates devote their lives to. And that seems odd in that, Harvard perceives itself as absolutely qualified and entitled to solve all kinds of problems all over the world, but not so committed to solving these problems: inequality, social and economic inequality, racism, sexism. And I think from my experience many years ago at the law school, something that was missing was it just wasn't glamorous. It's glamorous. You talk about burnout. People get burned out working at McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group and Goldman Sachs. Those are real burnout jobs, but everybody goes for them. And I don't think they're any more burnout than working in communities of need. So my question to you is, how do we push the university to really make this a priority and to make it glamorous and enticing for students to not just do it for a semester here or there, but to do it for the rest of their lives or for a significant portion of their lives?
So we want to make sure people watching the live stream online hear the questions, so I'm going to do my best to repeat them. And if I'm not fair to your question, please yell at me or wave at me. But I believe the heart of your question was engagement in public service can sometimes be episodic, and how do we make it a lifetime commitment? And maybe part of that is pushing Harvard as an institution to add some attention and glamour to people that do make that lifelong commitment. Is that a fair?
Yes, thank you.
Well, I guess I'll take a stab at it. I mean, I think that that's it's a key question. I think that's why a lot of us up here are trying to work in public service. But I will say that I'm heartened by the students themselves, who I think that what did surprise me is that students in particular addressing these concerns. So I've met a lot of undergraduate students who are thinking about internships, and you can tell they're on the cusp of doing something that's very expected of them, and i.e. very prestigious in terms of their summer internships, or doing something that they feel is very valuable in terms of public service. And oftentimes they make the choice to do public service. So I think that part of it is being there for them when they make that choice and supporting them when they make that choice. And also, I think a big component of it is helping to make sure that choice is a successful one and framing it as such. And so I think that once it becomes a kind of successful approach, however you measure that success, whether it's professional development or whether it's a Rhodes Scholarship at the end of it, I don't know. But I think that being supportive of the students as they make these critical decisions can help them develop public service into something that is not just something they do, but something that they find a wider value for. And then the university recognizes that as such.
Other thoughts?
I don't just want to be a cheerleader for Harvard Divinity School, but I guess I kind of feel like that because I agree. The students are just incredibly inspiring to me. And when I first speak to them, when they're like in their first week or something, and I have a panel and I'm talking to most of them, I just say, you know, thank you for making the choice to come and, you know, take your degree here, because most of you did have choices of a lot of different things to do with your life. And so we get them when they have chosen that. And you said earlier, you know, get out of their way. I often describe my job as running along behind students saying, wait, because they are. I think there's a sea change. I really feel like this generation, at least that I have the privilege to work with, I don't need to convince them that this is glamorous. I am not a leader in interpreting that to them. And maybe that's what you detected in me, you know, or whatever, but they are really interpreting to me. I don't have any worries about that. They get it that, you know, global climate change is something that has to be addressed, and they see that as an absolutely crucial thing to address. That type of attitude is just vibrant in our students. I see Maritza nodding in the front row.
I mean, I think I'm probably going to step in it. But I think that we could be more creative about how we recognize people who are working on hard problems. I mean, if, you know, think about who gets a lot of attention when they come back to campus. It is people with a lot of money. And it's people who have given a lot of money and people who are going to give more money. And the alumni events and all of that kind of thing are very geared toward that. And I mean, that's why Harvard is so successful at that. We get that. We do it really, really well. I mean, I think that we can try to be really creative about how do we recognize contribution and not just achievement as measured by wealth and dollars. And it's more than giving the public service award to one person in an alumni class, right? I mean, you know, and it's probably a rich person who is, you know, given a lot to the local food pantry or something even. All right, I'll quit being cynical. But at any rate, I mean, I think it's a good question. And I think that thinking about how do we recognize all of our students and how do we hold out, you know, kind of different ways of describing contribution. I mean, public service sounds kind of passive, right? I mean, and that really doesn't speak to the people who are dedicating their lives to working on hard problems and being quite creative about it. And again, I think the points of light approach is not enough to get us to a place where, you know, we don't just talk about it, that we actually collectively as a whole, you know, as a whole entity, raise up the number of students who really are going into these fields and contributing in big ways, and, you know, doing it in a way that kind of shows the size of that, because they will be recognized if they're, you know, that the lumps of people who are doing this. I mean, all the Kennedy School people, you know, pretty much, except for those that go into investment banking and you know, the Divinity School, but to kind of be recognized in the same way the rich people are.
And just to follow up, I so agree with what you're saying. I had the privilege of going to a wonderful independent high school in Boston, and the man who ran the school was a philanthropist. And when people would come and ask him, he was a left-wing philanthropist, and when people come and ask him for money, he would say, fine, give him some money, and I want you to come talk to the students after lunch. And he bankrolled the United Farm Workers organizing movement. And I met Cesar Chavez when I was 14. And he came into the library and his boots were dusty. He had really just come out of the fields. And it set me on a path for the next 20 years. And that's what it is. It's like, I hate to use the word glamorizing, but it is.
It's recognition.
It's recognizing,
Right.
showcasing.
Yeah.
And saying this is really as important as people with money.
I appreciate your question and your follow-up. And I'll confess that this is something I've struggled with a lot, because when I got engaged in what we're calling public service in college, there was this notion that it's selfless, and so you feel funny about getting attention for it. And I think over time I've realized, recognition is a human need. And also that, as you all are pointing out, at an institutional level, we have to say we value this. And I since you're bragging about Harvard Divinity School, Laurence and I will brag about the college. We have tried to do this. We're not where we should be, but the Phillips Brooks House Association has an annual lecture now. We've worked with the Harvard Alumni Association in putting a winter session conference together every year where we bring back alumni and recognize them, called Public Interested. So, and I would just add that I really respect the way President Faust she gets this and has tried to highlight public service. So we're not where we should be, but I do think this is shifting, or at least I hope it is. Dan, I saw your hand, and I'm going to take the liberty of bragging about Dan since his hand is up. Dan has gone on several alumni service trips and has a wonderful daughter, Kate, who is graduated from Harvard College and is now teaching school in New Orleans. And I just saw her last week. But I'm sorry.
I guess I had this kind of a fundamental question. I applaud, as an alum, I applaud Harvard's new focus in on public service. You're having administrative positions that are focused in on it, President Faust focusing on it. What is Harvard's or your conception of what public service is? What are the boundaries around it? Is it purely, it's not a profit motive? Is it service of humanity? What's your perspective on what the definition of it is, at least in the context here?
So again, I'm going to take a stab at summarizing the question, which, as I heard it, correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, was much appreciation for what we're talking about and things that are happening at Harvard, but public service, what we're talking about, and public service is a bit nebulous, and how do we define it? And since I'm only the moderator, I'm going to turn that question over to the panelist.
I was going to say, I wanted to hear what your answer to that was, because of your position.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
I'll start. I mean, because we think a lot about this, but the Kennedy School, because this is what we're equipping people for, and they do go out and they have careers in this, so they get paid. It's not the volunteer work that I think we've got to get away from just thinking about it as episodic volunteer work, and I think that's what we've been trying to talk about. That a lot of the activities here don't really represent that anymore. But I think it's creating public value. It's creating public value net of cost, and as opposed to creating wealth. I mean, that creating wealth is basically the fundamental purpose of for-profit corporations, and the activities we're talking about are creating public value. And the whole idea is creating public value that is, again, is moving the dial, which is why we always consider what is the cost of the activity. When it's volunteer work and it's actually moving the dial, because you have that in kind, but there's also the opportunity cost. But again, it's creating public value rather than wealth.
Yeah, and I would say with that, some of the things that we've already mentioned, it addresses some of the big problems that get erased when you're just talking about for-profit motive oftentimes. And it also addresses kind of big issues of social inequality if it's for the kind of public benefit rather than an individual corporation. So I think those are all components of it as well.
I'll give a very brief addition, which is we talk about ministry, and we have a very capacious definition for ministry here. You see how I said very, so that we include, traditional what you think of with that. But the way I like to talk about it is bringing your gifts to bear on human need.
That's nice. I don't think I can top that. I will quickly add that throughout the field, some people say civic engagement, some people say public service, some people say community service. So this, we struggle with definitions, but I think you all helped us get good handles on this. So thank you all. I see a hand back there, and then we'll come to you.
So given that you have a largely alumni audience here, virtually in the room, I'll speculate that there may be some among us who did not choose public service as a career, and that in this era of serial careers are considering options for that later in our lives. What would Harvard have, or what would you have to say about alumni in such a position?
So, again, trying to repeat the question, we're talking about engaging students in public service, but many alumni, after working in fields that might not be characterized as public service, might want to make that switch, especially in an age of people having several jobs throughout their lives. And what advice or support would Harvard have for them?
I'll go first again.
Was
Well,
that-
and I'll start at the low end versus real ultra high end. One thing is to contact, faculty and talk about, faculty who are engaged in the kinds of things you might be interested in, and, come and talk and get them on the phone or Skype them and say, what are the kinds of things I might be doing? I have those conversations a lot with people. Then there's executive education. The Kennedy School and the Business School have executive education in, public service topics, nonprofit management, these kinds of things where, you can kind of wallow in other language and other people who are doing this work and get ideas. We have a program called the Advanced Leadership Institute, which is the real high-end, or Advanced Leadership Initiative, real high-end, pay a lot of money to come back and have access to faculty, take courses, but also being in a holding environment in which you can craft your new enterprise. You can craft a new life for yourself. And I've been very pleased to have the opportunity to work with a number of those people who have come through, because they come, they take courses at the Kennedy School. And so I've got one who's a member of the mental health team in my course. He's a guy who's had a full career as a lawyer. He's back in this ALI program. He's auditing my course, and he's joined with 3 undergraduates on the team that's working on mental health in Boston now. And I'm sure that there are probably opportunities, there are field trips and this and that, your other schools organize.
Yeah.
I often work with mid-career students, and I'll just go ahead and give the advice that I give them. I don't think you have to, it's great, and we welcome mid-career students at Harvard Divinity School. But if you don't want to enter in a whole program, one of the things that I always tell mid-career students is there's 2 risks. One is that you leave your prior professional formation entirely behind, and that would be tragic. Because your professional formation that you've undergone has incredible riches that you can offer in public service. So the trick is to figure out how to pull upon that and offer that, and to learn some new ways of engaging. And so it's kind of a process of sort of filtering. But don't leave behind the incredible richness of your professional formation. We have, somebody who's very active as an alum here is Tom Chappell, and he founded Toms of Maine. And, this is somebody who's crafting together how to do corporate work. He has a new company now, but with real deep moral values. And so there's a lot of ways to craft together, what you've already been doing, and to bring some new initiative, I think. Have at it.
And I would quickly add, to be mindful of resources at Harvard. Alumni can access jobs through the Office of Career Services. Through the Harvard Alumni Association, you can get in touch with other alumni through Crimson Compass. So register with HA and get in conversation. But I certainly, I've served I don't know your particular background, but I've served my entire life in the nonprofit and public interest sector, and sometimes someone who's gained some real knowledge and skills in the private sector willing to come over is certainly welcomed and brings some real advantages and skills. You had a question?
Yeah, I wanted to get the perspectives of y'all on sort of the cultural shifts you've noticed, particularly with students, on this whole concept of creating value and the public good, and who are sort of now the gatekeepers of that. When I think of it, and I'm glad to hear about things that are going on at the Divinity School, I hear that this nation is becoming much less religious, which I think of that is how a lot of people in the past would sort of think about their public service and what they do, and it becomes like a lifelong continuity as it's tied to their
That's a good
religion.
point.
As we become much more religious, we become more spiritual, but much more religious, and it sort of gets decoupled. Sort of who then sort of plays that sort of ongoing role and gatekeepers in terms of, sure, at the academic level, but to your point, at the philanthropic level, there was a New York Times piece a couple of weeks ago talking about how philanthropic endeavors and interests are sort of usurping government's role in funding science. I worked at a biomedical government agency out in California before I moved here a few months ago, and we had $3 billion, but it wasn't enough, So we started to reach out to philanthropic dollars and to help us sort of fill in those gaps. And I'm just curious, what do you see? How does that ebb and flow with the student body in terms of what they're doing? Because I would think you would have less people going into the Divinity School, but I'm like, wow, I should have thought about that myself.
Well, come on over.
Got to recruit there.
That's a great question.
I'm fascinated with your question as I heard it, but I want to make sure I capture it. I think the heart of your question is that as there's evidence that American society is becoming less religious, what does that do for public service, since public service motivated many of us, since religion or faith motivated many of us.
Just how it shifts now, and
Yep.
you say the spotlight of the glamorization of philanthropists who will bring $1 billion, or,
Right.
and people can gravitate towards that. They're in control.
So just for our participants online, I think the heart of this question is with declining participation in religious life, what motivates people to give and be engaged in public service? What does that mean for public service and philanthropy?
Well, I'll take a crack at that. I think this is a great question, because what I'm thinking is, what are the organizing elements? I mean, this is there aren't any. There aren't any that are really stepping up in the same way. And I think that this is just a great way for us to think about a call for, as we mosey out into the community, as we're doing whatever public service we do, or whether it's in our jobs or in our volunteer life or whatever, thinking always about creating networks of capacity, linking other things, instead of being satisfied being more in control in a smaller environment. I think a lot of this is local, and I kind of really believe our responsibility is local first. And maybe one of the things the Academy can do, in fact, one of my colleagues, Ricardo Hausman at our Center for International Development, has developed a tool that helps the big multilateral agencies understand, and the big foundations understand, who's doing what in the whole list of sectors in countries. And so the people who are in agriculture in Uganda can see who all is spending what money in agriculture in Uganda. And just, one of the things we at Harvard can do is create these tools that at least allow people who want to go into a space not to avoid really understanding the space. It's a great question, and I think we can think about what might we be doing to enable organizing, enable people to find one another, enable people to take more responsibility for being part of those organizing spaces rather than, well, I'm going to do my own thing because I have $1 zillion.
Well, I'm not sure if I can speak to the religious dimension, but I think that part of the question is about what's motivating, like the bigger structural forces that are motivating public service at present. And I think part of it is, the climate that we find ourselves in this contemporary moment. I mean, I've had a lot of conversations since I've been here at Harvard with seniors who clearly came in thinking that something would have been promised to them upon graduation, and finding out that the state of the world is not such that as they expected. But I think what that also creates is a kind of a reflection about what is it that I want to do, and what is it that I value, what is it that will make me happy beyond the job that I always thought I was going to get or something once I graduated, right? So I think that's honestly part of it. I think that people are creatively putting together their interests, what they value, what they think is going to be fulfilling in a way that can address some of these big problems and can address and overlaps with what we are calling public service. So I think that's one issue.
So softball question for the Harvard Divinity School representative.
So one of the things that our person who was asking the question, I don't know your name. Lynn. So there are a couple of things. One was the premise was that society is becoming less religious. And I think that scholarship really doesn't suggest that we are becoming less religious. And it's confusing because we're much more conscious of the multi-religious context that we live in. And whether that's new or not is also up to debate. But a lot of what we do here is cultivate capacity to work effectively and respectfully in a context of multi-religious commitments. And a piece of that, and that includes people who are not religious as well. When I say that, there are people who are deeply committed to public service, but not out of a religious commitment. And so the issue is, how do you form respectful hybrid partnerships? And that's what I see our students doing. Again, me running along behind them. What I see them doing is not so much, looking to become a gatekeeper or to navigate with a gatekeeper, but instead, how do I come along somebody who really has some very different things at stake and some very different perspectives in a way that actually is very good news for the problem I'm trying to address.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Other questions? Clint?
Yeah, I have a question about the balance between the entrepreneurial mindset of students nowadays and the fast-moving nature and the need to solve problems, oftentimes in 2 years or 4 years or however long they're here, with the slower-moving large structures and nonprofits. Oftentimes, thinking about the government, students want to create an entrepreneurial idea that affects things that the government's trying to solve, but the government can, our organization of the government can do quantitative easing and affect more people than 1 million startups and entrepreneurial ideas together. So I'm wondering how we motivate students to go into organizations, big organizations, and change them, and yet be entrepreneurial and try to do their own thing.
So again, just to take a stab at repeating an excellent question, with a current emphasis on entrepreneurism, how do you take advantage of that entrepreneurial emphasis while balancing it with sometimes that making the world a better place involves getting involved in organizations and being there for the long haul.
This
Was
is something.
Was that a decent summary?
Yeah, this is something we're grappling with at the Kennedy School all the time. And a lot of us who are squarely in the advising and teaching space there are turning to help students actually understand that that there are better alternatives than just starting your own thing. And one of the things I think we can do is think about how we support the outcome goals and help students really understand when their idea may be something new. It's a new movement, it's a new service, it's a new product, it is a new theory of change, and therefore it's either starting their own thing or shopping it to existing places, but not celebrate the idea of starting something. I mean, we've gone overboard, and I applaud President Faust's support of social entrepreneurship, but rewarding more people just to start things is not the right signal. And so I think that what we have to do is help students actually really keep their eye on the problem that they're trying to solve, and encourage their critical thinking about why they have an idea that needs to be embodied in a new entity. I think if we're doing our jobs, again, I think we've got to step back and quit celebrating social entrepreneurship for the sake of social entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I mean, if I can add, since I'm in the Department of African and African American Studies and Anthropology, I think students have a little bit different orientation, but I think generally the question holds. I think part of it is about kind of recalibrating expectations and recalibrating what a solution means, right? And I think that, and again, this goes back to the importance of learning outside of the classroom, because in those experiences, you really see that the kind of overhaul that one might have imagined is not going to take place. So then the question becomes, okay, what is something that I can ask and answer for a paper versus something that I can ask and answer for a thesis versus something that I can work on as a potential career? And you see students developing that progression, and I think that that's the role of the professor, to help students kind of divide a big solution into some manageable steps in that way.
One of the ways I sometimes describe it to students is, imagine yourself as a pilot of a really long, huge ship, and you see that there's rocks in the distance. So what do? You go like this with the wheel, and how does the boat move? Like this. But it makes all the difference where it winds up, right? It's a totally different place, but the pace of change is really slow. So I do think explaining to students, how do you respect the actual pace of change. But I don't want to totally dispense with entrepreneurial spirit, and I don't think anyone else does either, because we need that creative, agile spirit and we need to fan that at the same time as we introduce the reality of the slow pace of change.
Yeah, I think, as with what is public service, how do we define religion, there's also questions about how to define entrepreneurism. Can you be entrepreneurial within an existing institution without feeling like you always have to be starting something? But great question, great responses. I think we have time for one last question. Excellent.
So I really liked the point that you had made earlier about living in a place of discomfort, since so much of our learning happens and we understand what makes us happy, we understand so much better values. I recently graduated from the education school, and one thing that I think as students what we always looked for was finding ways to sustain that discomfort in the classroom setting, so we could have more engaging dialogues which are based on controversy. To give you an example, when we were talking about Freire's theory of pedagogy of the oppressed, and shedding privilege and realizing that many of us were privileged and we didn't even know or realize or see ourselves that way. But how do we continue to encourage faculty to create opportunities for us to engage in those kinds of moments? Because I felt that it was never enough. And I think that could be a symptom of us students feeling like we could be in that space where we could challenge each other. But I'm wondering if it was just an ed school problem or if this happens in other schools as well, like the business school. Do they have opportunities to engage in this format as well?
Terrific question. I'm going to try to repeat it and wave madly if I don't nail it. But returning to the theme of the learning and growth that comes through discomfort, and how engagement in the world creates discomfort, how do we give more permission, or how do we give permission to faculty to create such discomfort, and maybe push students more to recognize their privilege and enter spaces where they're uncomfortable?
Well, I just asked that.
Laurence.
I mean,
It's not always good for the Q ratings, right?
yeah. I mean, I think it's a question that again has to do with learning outside of the classroom. In particular, I mean, with the ed school, I think a lot of people, come from previous backgrounds as teachers, or they're going to return to the classroom in some capacity. So that's always there. That idea that there's real people that you have to engage with, and how do you engage with that? And that's a question. In anthropology, that's always a question too, because we want to work with different groups. We want to work with cultures that are different from us. So I think that it kind of has to do with that, but it also has to do with the basic question of how do professors foster that. I think part of it is, again, fostering an environment where it's not about the anxiety of a grade and it's not about saying the right thing all the time, and it's not about just regurgitating a theory or something like that. I think it's an environment where people are working collaboratively to engage in a set of problems, or to work together to solve something, and also to then build something. And so I think that that's the kind of classroom in which those kind of spaces of discomfort can be opened up, because they can only be opened up when people feel a kind of sense of urgency to grapple with the problem.
I'm a big fan of creating significant learning experiences in my classroom. I always bring Paulo Freire, and you were quoting him in the way you framed the question. And, I think we have to decide, are we a banking model of education where there is one expert depositing knowledge into students, or are we creating an environment where people have significant learning experiences that actually creates knowledge in the classroom that is not entirely created by the professor? And this semester I've been doing very experiential learning with my students about collaborative learning. And I have found, and they've articulated this, that, it's very hard because the paradigm is individual achievement and demonstrating individual excellence. And so to invite people into a space where they, instead of that, are working on how do I work collaboratively is, I think we've got to do that. I think that's exactly the kind of skills we have to convey on people.
I mean, you're talking about real basic teaching skills and learning as faculty how to be in a place of discomfort ourselves. And that is not a place we like to be. And it's not a place we're good at in some cases. I mean, if you're a white woman, like I am, and you're not equipped to talk about race, and you're afraid of saying something wrong, then the easy way is just not to bring it up. Because the students won't, and if you're not equipped, if I'm not equipped to lead a discussion and make it comfortable when it does come up, then students quickly learn about that norm. And so whether it's learning how to step back out of being the pivot point for all the conversation and trust that this is going to take place, or raising uncomfortable subjects and creating a safe space in which the students can dwell in that and not be afraid. And I mean, all of these things it's a real craft, and I think it takes courage for the faculty member to step into there, but also accept help. I mean, we have resources across the university to help faculty do all these things. And I think it behooves, the Kennedy School is trying to get faculty to really understand how important it is to kind of raise these kind of things and teach in this way, and they provide resources. But, we only lead faculty up, and if they don't want to drink, we don't make them. And so again, I think there needs a lot of institutional support. But testimony from alumni is really nice about that. Saying I learned some skills there, and I'd like to actually learn how to do it more, and more during my time would have been great.
Yeah, that's very helpful.
Terrific questions. I really appreciate you all's questions, your being here, people watching online. I want to thank the Harvard Alumni Association again for pulling this wonderful event together. The good news is the conversation does not have to stop. There's a reception in this room, so I hope you will stay and talk more to our panelists. But most of all, let's thank our panelists for being here and for their leadership in public service and for sharing themselves with us this evening.
Thank you.